king over much of the Holy Land, particularly what we would call the northern kingdom, eventually, Israel. So most of the tribes recognize, for better for worse, we need a king, we need a leader. Why not Saul's oldest son? The only living son. At the same time, this is something I didn't realize while I was studying to put this whole series together. The Philistines, remember David's in line with the Philistines for a bit? The Philistines set David up to be one of their vassal kings over the largest tribe, which is Judah. Okay? So David is named king over Judah, kind of like Herod. Remember in the New Testament, Herod is king of the Jews here, but he's really placed under the Roman authority, right? And so Pontius Pilate, when he comes to town, Pontius Pilate trumps Herod, okay? So David is technically king of Judah, but he's only placed there because he's a friendly king, and he's loyal. The Philistines assume he's loyal to them. He's not. He's not, but they assume he is. And so now you've got two kings at one time. This guy, the only living son of Saul, only lasts 2 years as king. He's a very weak king. He ends up being murdered by his own people. David very wisely, instead of going after and making fun of this northern kingdom and that kingship, he wisely says, he shames the people that murdered that king. He recognizes that king's authority, and he honors that king. He actually executes the people who killed him on David's behalf. And what ends up happening with a few just systematic, good diplomatic moves is all the people recognize that David's a blessed man. So he, unlike Saul, who was just a military guy, David understands through the wisdom of God how to unite the people in a really difficult situation. Is this all this making sense? This is kind of wild, a lot of information. Okay. So what ends up happening is Israel ends up joining. And so you've got one, I've got a map in the back of your handout there. You've got one monarchy at this point. Israel fully recognizes Judah. After that happens, David forms an army, and it's not just made up of asking people from the tribes to come. He actually hires an army, trains them. They're permanently military folks. Because before then, you would just take your pitchforks and whatever you had, and farmers would go out and fight the fight and go back to work. He actually employs for the first time soldiers who lived that's what their job was. We know, that's how we live today, but back then that's not how it was always done in the tribal time. So David now has this army. He's trained them. Under the power of God, he goes out and completely defeats an attack that the Philistines throw at him, because they recognize now that he's not their vassal king any longer. So they come to divide the kingdom. They come up on the north side of Jerusalem to fight him. David launches a counterattack, defeats them. They come back the next year to do the same thing. He defeats them again, and they drive them back to the coastland. Well, David then says, we've been playing defense for the past 450 years. Let's play some offense. And so David goes after the Philistines and beats them to a pulp, so that the Philistines technically are still a people, but their military is completely crushed. They now live under the taxation and under the rule of David. That makes sense? So the Philistines are finally crushed. That's one of the reasons that in Jewish history David is so beloved, because he represents success. He actually succeeded in that. After that, Jerusalem becomes the capital. Jerusalem is a city right here. You had all these other, if you look at your map, you have all these other tribes scattered around, and you've got Jerusalem is in the middle. Most people don't know this, but when the tribes settled, Jerusalem was actually owned by a Canaanite community. It wasn't in the land of any of the tribes. It was in this strange pocket. As there were tribes set up all over, in betweens, in the cracks of the tribes, there were other peoples. Because remember that again in Joshua, they didn't annihilate everybody. So all these people were scattered around. So what God gave David wisdom-wise was to for him to relocate from his own hometown of Horeb to Jerusalem and claim it. And it was a very wise move because Jerusalem was a wonderful city in a strategic location with springs of water up in the mountains. It's incredible. And yet it wasn't in any of the tribes. And so no tribe could say he's playing favorites. Does this make sense? And he also moved into that town with his folks, and he didn't kill anybody. The people who were already there were allowed to remain. Interesting. It's an interesting concept compared to what we've seen. And so David strategically picks Jerusalem for its location. If it's close to any tribe, it's the tribe of Benjamin, which is one of the smallest and I guess weakest of the tribes. So Jerusalem was just a real strategic gift given from God to help this process go through. Under King David, what happens then is that the entire land is unified. His rule, with all the cracks are filled in so that people could live there that aren't Jews, but they are under his lordship. Does this make sense? They have to start paying taxes to King David in the Jewish kingdom. And so for the first time, this geographical entity becomes Israel. So Israel is not just a people. It's kind of like saying the United States. When I ask about the United States, first thing we think about is where it's located on a map. We're used to that. But imagine we were a nation without a land. It's hard to imagine, isn't it? But the United States as a people could be wandering. We could be in technically the land of Canada at one point, down in Mexico at another point. But for the first time in the history of the Jewish people, Israel was a piece of land in addition to a people in a full sense. Does that make sense? Am I boring you or are you with it? This good? Okay. This is what's in the Bible. Okay. All right. So Israel becomes a geographic location. Then, if you look at your map on the back, David then goes after first Ammon. It's just on the other side of the river Jordan. He goes after Moab and Edom, then he goes up after Syria. And what he ends up doing is he allows those people to live, but he's expanded what we would call the empire of the Jewish people, so that they are now under his rule. So their religions can remain intact, their cultures can remain intact. But now finally, for the first time, beyond their own land, the Jewish people are now expanding an empire. And you do that strategically. I'm not a military guy, but strategically to if you're not on offense, if you're not playing offense, you're also not playing defense, kind of thing. So he began to expand to grow the empire. And finally, at the end of his leadership, one problem arose. There was a problem of a successor. And this is when it gets real messy. There was a guy named Absalom, who was the son of one of David's many wives. Real quick, just to throw some Bible story in the middle of it. When he's first going after growing the empire, the first place he goes after is Ammon. That was the battle that was being fought when he was sleeping with Bathsheba. Okay, that was the battle that Uriah died in, Bathsheba's husband. Okay, so all the military stories actually. Hopefully this will give you a framework when you're reading the stories of David and all the scripture stories we look at, where they fall into actual timeline of military and economic growth. Okay, so Absalom is one of David's many sons. Absalom has a sister. David has another son who's the oldest. His name is, I think it's Ammon. I'm going off memory at this point. Well, his oldest son ends up having a thing for his stepsister, who's Absalom's real sister, full sister, rapes her. And then David doesn't do anything about it. And so Absalom is so mad that he leaves town. He goes back to Horeb, actually, which is where David comes from. He says he's the new king, the new successor, because he can't believe what had just happened with the oldest son, who was most likely going to become the king. That oldest son is murdered by Absalom, and so he's now in this horrible situation where he's enraged that his sister's been raped. He's been enraged that this righteous King David hasn't done anything to make it right. He's killed his stepbrother, his half brother, and now he feels like he's going to be the new charismatic leader of Jerusalem. So with all these things building up, he's decided to lead a revolt against David. It doesn't work. David ends up having to forgive Absalom, which was a very big thing of David to do. So that was the first revolt. The second revolt to take over the next king is going to be Sheba. And that's somebody who's not even related to David, but he's related to King Saul, and he wants to reclaim the throne, and it's real messy. And so finally, David has to make a decision, because how did David come to the throne? Was he born royalty? So there's no rule, right? What's the rule? And he hears from God a vow, the Davidic vow, that his kingdom will know no end, that his throne will not end. And so he understands that the next successor will have to be one of his kin. He has conveniently already promised Bathsheba that her son with him will be the next king, and his name is King Solomon. And so that's the first time in the life of the Jewish people that you have a united kingdom, a formal entity as a nation, and now a plan to succeed the throne. So the assumption is after King Solomon, who next? Solomon's oldest son, right? So that's been a lot of change in just about 50 years up to that point, from people wandering in the desert, receiving the law of Moses. Can you see how much transition that is that quickly? Okay, and I think that's why the Bible spends so much time in this part of the story. Real quickly, King Solomon, his role in all this, ultimately in God's story, was to hold the kingdom together. He didn't really expand the empire. He's known as the wise person. There's actually a lot of issues that problems under his leadership. His foreign policy was built on treaties and marriages. He married one of Pharaoh's daughters, and Pharaoh wouldn't have traditionally even married his daughter off to an Assyrian emperor or a Babylonian. So to marry one of his daughters off to this small kingdom known as the Hebrews, the Jews, was incredible. It was incredible. So he had a huge treaty happening between he and Egypt that allowed Egypt to be nice to the kingdom. He fortified all these military locations around. So he took where the empire was set up, and he went and built these big fortification areas like Megiddo. If you were to go visit the Holy Land, a lot of the fortifications are built during this time by King Solomon. Obviously, he built the temple. We know that. He had big growth in terms of commerce. The city of Tyre, which is up here on the coast, was built. The treaty was built between King David, Solomon's dad, and the king of this city, Tyre. Tyre was able to retain his own king, but they had to allow the great kingdom of Israel to use their city as a major port, as if Israel owned it. If you were to look at a wider version of this map, you would notice that the Holy Land, the Gaza Strip, is an incredibly important trade route to get from modern-day Egypt to modern-day Turkey. And so there's a lot of money traded right then. The Queen of Sheba, you've heard of the Queen of Sheba, Ethiopian king? She actually came and visited Solomon. It's in the Bible. She came and visited Solomon at this point. They created a treaty together as well. Her name goes all the way to the forward in history to the Ethiopian eunuch who was reading the scroll of Isaiah. Remember when Philip evangelized, and this is an Acts, evangelized and saved this Ethiopian eunuch? Well, she was believed to have been the one to bring the basic understanding of Judaism to the Ethiopians. Very strange, like how these things come together. So, all these things happen under Solomon to make sure the kingdom holds together. But what ends up happening overall is the kingdom has a huge fiscal issues. They are spending much more money than they're taking in. Ever been there? And people get anxious. He starts overtaxing. He takes the people that they used to live alongside and allowed for them to live in freedom. He actually enslaves these smaller Canaanite tribes for slave labor. He has to make these choices if they're going to keep this thing afloat. That makes sense? And so during the Golden Age, which is the age of Solomon, the scriptures also teach that there was a dark side to it. There was a danger to it. And what ends up happening is right after Solomon passes away, all this work that they had done to bring this thing together disintegrates. All this work that they had done. And so, as I've said, all that stuff, you needed all that history. I know it sounds boring, but you just needed it because it's important to understanding of what happened in that time period. There were a few big tensions and changes that we need to deal with, and that the Jewish people had to deal with. The first one was symbolic, that the Ark of the Covenant was now placed in a temple that was made up of huge building materials. It was absolutely 100% stationary. Theologically, what the Jewish people had to go through at that point was that their understanding of God, who was this God who was all-powerful, would travel with them, would call them to wander through the desert, would call them to inherit this land, and maybe do something else in the future, was now fixed. So God, it was a big symbolic issue to take the Ark of the Covenant, which would go with them to battle and things, was now placed in a frozen facility. The religion had become almost a museum. Okay? And that may sound normal to us, but for these people who had learned to live by God feeding them manna in the desert, to live desperately as if they were like a baby still connected by the umbilical cord, just wherever God was, we're going to go and follow God. Now God is an established religion, established in a facility, in one location, in which you go there to worship Him. And it's hard for us to really grab hold of how big of a paradigm shift that must have been for the people. Another theological change they had to deal with is they were faithful up to that point to this God of covenants. That's where we are, right? And now they're being called to be faithful to a state, to a nation, to a king. And how do they keep those two things in balance? How do they do that? So that was two of the big deals. Politically, they had to deal with, which ends up disintegrating the whole kingdom, with this issue of tribal independence. You know, the northern kingdoms, as much as they liked David and all, they had their own traditions, they had their own way of doing things, they had their own parts of the stories they liked to tell. And plus, Jerusalem's way down here, and we're way up here. And so over time, this issue of independence ate at people, and didn't last but 100 years before these things split apart. So there was always that tension, even during the kingdom, between a centralized authority under one person. And then the hardest one was changing traditions. It's the last one I wrote, moving from ancient tradition to a new order. Now this is a part of the story, and I can't interpret it for you. The Jewish people consider this one of the heights of the story. They beg when Jesus returned, Son of David, right? Messiah. This is where the idea of Messiah took place right after this, when somebody like David was going to come back and restore the kingdom to Israel. And the big stream of Jewish theology and thought, this was the height of the established power of God's people under Yahweh. But then there's some tensions that make me wonder, was this original? Was this the best time? Or was the best time in the desert? You see that? Was the best time when the people were desperate for the Word of God? I think there's a lot of parallels between the church and the covenantal people. What's our best time? When we've made it? Full pews, influence in town? Or is it when we're wandering in the desert, hungry for God? I know history likes to uplift the victories in battles, the building of great buildings like a temple with the ark in it. History loves to talk about Solomon's glory, but kind of quietly deals with the fact that there was a fiscal crisis. And so that's something for you to interpret in this story. Because, God's story is our story. We've been grafted into it. And as we're going to get to the church here in several weeks, I know this, we're on covenant for a long time. The covenantal time is just such an